Hello and welcome to today's webinar titled Managing the Growing Demands of Responsible Gambling in 2025. My name is Jack Halliday and I'll be running today's webinar. Before I hand over to today's speakers, I'd like to remind all attendees to please engage as much as possible by asking questions. If you have any audio or visual issues or questions during the broadcast, please message in the chat box. And I also want to remind you that today's session is being recorded and a full version of the recording will be sent out after the webinar. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to today's moderator, Tom Simcock.
Thank you very much for joining us today for our webinar titled Managing the Growing Demands of Responsible Gambling in 2025. And I'd just like to introduce our panel. So we've got Paula Murphy from Mindway, we've got Max Collinge from Yaspa, and we've got Zach Burnban from Vixio, and also myself, Tom Simcock from Vixio as well. I'll just let our panel give a little bit of introduction about themselves. So Paula, if you would just like to introduce yourself.
Yep, sure. Thanks for that, Tom. So hi, everybody. My name is Paula Murphy. I am Head of Business Development for Mindway AI. I think most people in the industry know Mindway these days, but we basically bring together a really unique combination of neuroscience, expert psychological assessment, and AI technology to do player tracking, looking for signs of problematic play in the operator databases.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Paula. Max, if I could just ask you to introduce yourself now.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So hi, everyone. I'm Max, Head of Products at Yaspa. Yaspa is an open banking payment and identity company. And recently we've become quite heavily involved in the iGaming industry on the back of winning an Innovate UK award, looking at enabling more sustainable gambling experiences from exploring the use of financial data as part of the payment process. Prior to my time joining Yaspa, I spent 6-7 years at NatWest, where I led the product development for NatWest Group's open banking payment solution, Payit.
Thanks very much for that, Max. And Zach, if you could just introduce yourself as well, please.
Sure, thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone. My name is Zach Birnbaum, and I'm the Principal Analyst and Regulatory Lead for the Americas at Vixio Regulatory Intelligence within our Regulatory Intelligence function. As part of Vixio, we're a RegTech platform covering the gambling industry, payments industry, helping businesses within those segments, helping them stay compliant across a wide range of regulatory changes within those industries, and happy to be here.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone on the panel for joining us today. And I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation about responsible gambling. We're going to talk about a few different things during the call, just depending on exactly how much time we have. Firstly, I want to talk about affordability in responsible gambling, and also AI and what it can bring to responsible gambling aside from monitoring player behavior. Also, I'd like to look at the potential impact of the Safe Bet Act in the United States, and also duty of care requirements for responsible gambling in Europe, and if we have some time, also talking about gambling advertising and the effect of that on responsible gambling. Overall, the webinar is going to delve into the world of responsible gambling from a regulatory perspective, helping you stay ahead of the curve so you can maintain a proactive compliance strategy for responsible gambling. So without further ado, I'd like to put our first question to the panel. So I'd like to start with AI, which is always at the moment a hot topic in gambling. And the question is, what can AI bring to responsible gambling aside from monitoring player behavior? And an example of that are large language models, and whether they're going to come commonplace for customer interactions. For anyone who doesn't really know much about large language models, there are AI computer programs that allow the understanding and generation of natural language. And Paula, I'd just like to start with you on that question and hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Tiny little question to kick off with here, and I did bring my crystal ball. You'll be pleased to know. So yeah, large language models. Well, I think the first thing to say is that they are actually already being used. We use them in our code development as matter of course already. I'm going to actually dissect the question a wee bit, because you're asking me about what else does it bring, as well as the sort of monitoring of player behavior. And I think the answer to this is that it's always got to start off with the monitoring of player behavior. We've got to begin with that intrinsic understanding of the risk distribution of our player database. And the reason for that is because that is very, very much the foundation of what we need to build on. We need to identify the different behaviors within the different players so that we can then build on that to communicate with them in those individualized, personalized way. But do I think that large language models will play a part in that as we move forward? Yes, I absolutely do. And I'd certainly know that if you had any one of the members of our tech team on here, they'd be very excited about this question being included, because there is a lot of work going on back in Aarhus around how they can be used, not just in furthering past the detection, but also in the detection itself as well. I think the key consideration when you ask me about interventions, yes, I think they probably will. And when you consider that a model will be able to take in a lot of information, a lot of data about that individual player, and will be able to generate dynamic content, I'm talking down the line in the future here, that is something that we can all imagine being a huge time saver, and that would massively enable us to personalize all manner of different interaction communication. But it comes with a huge caveat that we need to make sure that we keep the human in the loop as well. I was on a panel last week where somebody was actually talking about, they actually said that they don't even think AI exists yet, because we've not got to that level of intelligence. So that level of human oversight and understanding of what the model is suggesting is really, really important. Now, Mindway is very much built on bringing together this combination of human expertise. I like to call it HI, human intelligence, and AI. Obviously, what we want to do there is keep that sort of human input in as much as we possibly can. So I feel like it will be feeding that information into these models, enabling them to generate a response. But then how we automate that response from there, I still think there's a little bit of work to be done on. I wouldn't want to just send it out straight away without having some sort of supervision on it, shall we say, to begin with. But it will get better and better as we move forward and our understanding moves forward.
Okay, thanks for that answer. It's really, really interesting to hear. Just if I could just ask a follow-up question. Do you think players will be comfortable talking potentially to a computer about their gambling? Because obviously that is, if it's not happening already, there's a potential for that to happen.
That's another great question. And it sort of taps into another bit of the vast knowledge base we've got within Mindway, because for me, this is about sort of psychology and understanding cultural differences as well. I think some players would be actually prefer to be talking to a computer, as it were. I think it's generational. So there is evidence that shows that younger players, those that fit into sort of Gen Z, they're more used to actually communicating in that way, and they're probably more comfortable communicating in that way. Your grandmas like me, I'm not actually a grandma, by the way, but the older community like myself, I mean, I would personally much rather somebody picked up the telephone and spoke to me, human to human contact. But I think the key thing about it is that there will be a level of understanding around that, and that as well as giving direction on what the next course of action should be in terms of the content of an interaction, I think the models will be able to also give direction on the best platform for that interaction as well, based on what we know about the individual players.
Okay, thank you for answering that question. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. If anyone has anything else they'd like to add on that.
Yeah, it was just to follow on, Tom, to the question, really, because I think a really key element of this is obviously those models being stringent and performing well. So an example recently was I was testing a kind of beta version model that a third party had put out there that was promoting a kind of chatbot type service under the kind of theme of sustainable gambling. And quite quickly, from my interaction with the chatbot, it was quite easy to go from telling the chatbot that I had a concern about my gambling activity and the amount of money that I'd spent over the last week across a number of operators, to the chatbot actually encouraging me to place deposits. And it only took me 3 separate messages to go from the chatbot showing some concern about my gambling to then suggesting football matches at the weekend to place bets on. So I think, and Paula and Mindway are a great example of kind of building robust language models for the industry. But I think some of the new solutions like Yaspa's, they need to be kind of tested properly to make sure that these models are working as we expect them to.
Yeah, and that doesn't end, right? It's not like, oh, now it's working, boxes ticked. We need to make sure that there isn't drift, and we need to make sure that obviously what is being suggested is very sensible. And that's why I'm still very much sort of on board with the idea that the AI technology can bring the information and deliver the information to the humans that are doing the role in a way that it makes it very, very easy for them to consume and make decisions very quickly. But actually, it should be the human being that is sense checking that and making sure that any communication that goes out is what it should be. So actually, a good example of this is at the very start of Mindway AI, before we even existed with anything in the gambling space, our founder, Professor Kim Marodson, was using a version of the machine learning technology that we use today in medical diagnostics. Now, obviously, it wasn't sort of diagnosing what was happening with the patients and then straight away action would be taken. There was a doctor in the loop, but it enabled them to make much quicker decisions. And when you think about things like somebody having a stroke, time is the single most important thing. It enabled them to act quickly. You can bring that back to safer gambling, and you can have a timely intervention that is individualized, it's personalized. You can get direction on what the next course of action should be. But in terms of how you then roll that out, I don't think we should be relying on the robots.
Okay, thanks very much for both of those responses. If we just move to a different topic, affordability. What can the gambling industry learn from financial services in terms of affordability requirements and checks? Obviously, this is a sort of, again, a hot topic in the UK gambling industry. And I was wondering, Max, if I could just start with you and get your thoughts on this area, this topic.
Yeah, so it's a very topical question, Tom, as you just alluded to there. Obviously, we've just had the rollout this year of soft checks, and we're in the kind of latter stages now of the enhanced risk checks pilot being run by the UK Gambling Commission. So the UK Gambling Commission is effectively trying to test the effectiveness of credit bureaus being able to provide credit risk model insight into the gambling industry and provide information such as, has someone missed a mortgage payment, or has someone had a default on their account in the last 6 years, and a risk score associated to that be something that's useful to a gambling company in terms of interpretation of affordability. And one of the things I would say there in terms of affordability generally is affordability in the finance industry has been something that's been around assessing financial risk to be able to provide a credit facility. So when we apply for loans, when we apply for mortgages, what a credit bureau will do for a credit provider is it will help the credit provider make an assessment on your ability to repay that loan or that mortgage over a period of time. So these models that have been developed over years have been looking specifically at indicators that if someone takes credit, are they likely to be able to pay that credit back? And it's all about a credit provider being able to make revenue on accruing interest on those credit facilities. So I think one of the challenges that I've been made aware of from kind of collaborating with operators on open banking as an alternative to this approach is that the bureaus have a relatively incomplete picture of someone's financial activity. So that view over a 6-year period over whether someone's missed a mortgage repayment or they've had a default, not only is that potentially penalizing someone for past behavior, but also it could be because someone that month just hadn't moved money into the account where the direct debit was set up. So having access to that type of insight without a broader understanding of someone's income, someone's spending pattern, someone's depositing behavior in relation to their gambling, I think it becomes very complex for an operator to take that raw data point around a default or a missed mortgage payment and actually apply that in a meaningful way when thinking about their players and their players' affordability. I also think there are some ethical concerns around using credit bureaus in this way, because ultimately credit bureaus and the assessments that potentially could be rolled out are non-consented. So the individual might not even necessarily be aware that the operator has requested this financial data and is using it to make an assessment on the player. So where I've been working with Yaspa over the last year has been to look at an alternative approach to kind of moving what's worked in the financial industry around affordability and try and force that into the gambling industry, but to take a step back and to look at the opportunity that open banking provides with a consent-driven process and access to real-time transaction information. So our model that we've developed now is based on real-time financial data. So we analyze someone's lifestyle, their spending behaviors. We look at their income and the reliability of that income and can detect changes in circumstance, like someone losing their job or having a period of lower income than they've had in previous months. But then importantly, to try and enrich what Paula and Mindway look at is to look at depositing behavior across a number of gambling operators. So our model looks for things that Mindway might look for in the sense of what's the frequency of deposits, what's the intensity in a short period of time, and we pick out those markers of harm and have applied that approach to financial data. And the other point I'd say around that is I also think there's too much emphasis on the operators to kind of make these decisions around affordability. And I think where we as an industry should go to create a more sustainable approach is to look at opportunities to play some of this data back to the players themselves. So a good opportunity here might be that as part of the rollout of deposit limits coming at the 31st of October this year, where every player on registration is going to have to subscribe to a deposit limit, I think there are opportunities here for us to look at helping that player to make that decision. So, and a really good example of this is in the US, the number one thing that influences someone to save towards their 401k is the default limit that a company sets. So if it's 3%, when they go through that onboarding process, they'll set it at 3%. And I think we're at risk with the introduction of the deposit limits that same behavior will happen in the gambling industry, where the deposit limits are set at what the operator determines is a kind of sensible amount for their business. So I think what we're looking at and have been working with operators on is this opportunity to provide what I describe as a behavioral nudge, to play back some of the information around their financial data and their spending activity, to provide them with information to be able to make their own assessment around what is a sustainable level of spend for them in relation to their gambling.
Okay, thanks for that, Max. Really interesting stuff. And I'd like to come back to your point about sort of sharing more information with the player later on. You touched on the US a bit there. Zach, anything that you wanted to add on this question, just from your US perspective?
Yeah, and I know we're going to talk about the Safe Bet Act in a little bit, but it's interesting that one of the trickle-down effects from the Safe Bet Act has been the trickle-down affordability checks across state regulators. Things in the U.S. are much more limited when it comes to affordability checks. They've not been really in place across any legalized gaming state since the repeal of PASPA in 2018. The limited affordability checks that we have seen proposed are, to Max's point, very much limited to one type of behavior, which is in Massachusetts, for example, earlier this year, one of the bills that was proposed implementing affordability checks for any wager above $1,000 a day or $10,000 a month, but it requires operators to verify that there is more than 15% of funds available for that wager. So to Max's point, it's solely and strictly on the operators to verify this while it's a requirement from the legislature. So I think it's interesting to consider that looking at it in that limited way is actually potentially a driver of harm rather than a reduction of harm.
Okay. Thanks for that, Zach. And just coming back to another thing you said, Max, and you talked about getting data from a number of different sources, perhaps a number of different operators. So I wanted to ask about the single customer view in the UK. And in order to protect players sufficiently, do you think a single customer view is required in the UK gambling industry?
I think it depends. I think if we look at someone like a Mindway, for example, and they're a great example of providing player protection in the industry, but Mindway has built its model by being able to analyze player behavior over a long period of time, historically, but then also being able to build up that view of the player as they on board with an operator and as we're able to analyze operator data about their behavior. But I think one of the areas where we can look to kind of enrich that understanding of the player is by looking at the point of deposit being where we collect the consent to enable open banking access to someone's financial information. And as I mentioned previously, look at the opportunity to analyze spending behavior across a number of operators to assess kind of patterns of gambling activity, not just with this particular operator, but previous behavior, and help to enrich that view at the early stage of someone coming through an operator to build out a good understanding from the first day about the type of this behavior that this individual demonstrates, with a view to providing a more sustainable experience. I think without having access to financial information and being able to analyze that information, I think we do, over the longer term, expose people to financial vulnerability. So a really good example of this is there was a study by HSBC back in 2021 that looked at their portfolio of customers and how they gambled across a base over a year. And they found that the 23,000 people that were gambling across 6 operators or more were ones that they would classify as very concerning. And then when they compared that cohort of population against a population of 1.4 million, which gambled, but HSBC classified as in control, they were gambling typically across 1 or 2 operators. But the key impact around financial vulnerability was that the population that were in control were likely to have 50% more wealth overall than the individual that was gambling across 6 operators. And I think by not being aware of some of this wider financial implication, we do run the risk of people becoming vulnerable because of their gambling activity and their behavior across a number of operators. My last point on this will be, I think there are some approaches out there in Europe that haven't necessarily been that successful with trying to implement the single customer view. And I think what we're seeing in the UK is starting, and banks are starting to look at ways that they can intervene with their players and provide them with insight about their gambling activity. So the Racing Post recently posted an article about Santander contacting their customers to in an email type format, which wasn't very well communicated, but it was basically accusing that customer of gambling too much and was quite poorly written. And I think if banks are starting to take that approach or wanting to take that approach, I think that there is this general awareness around customer vulnerability in the financial industry, but also at a regulatory level, that we do need to look at ways that we can provide that access and that insight to the players. I don't think banks should be the ones that provide that messaging and that information, because they won't have the expertise to manage that interaction properly. But also, I think the interaction has to happen with the operator, because the operator is where the person is when they're eliciting the gambling behavior.
Okay. Sorry, Paula, go ahead.
Yeah, I've got a few bits I'd like to sort of build upon and add there. I actually completely agree with Max when he talks about early life behavior, because obviously when you have a model that is looking at behavior over a period of time, when somebody signs up on site, you don't have that back data to build upon. So your model becomes stronger and stronger as it sort of gets to know the player, as it were. So I think that a lot of this work that those guys that Max and his team are doing around sort of understanding financial vulnerabilities, understanding what that looks like, the research in that space, I think it's really valuable when it comes to that early life bit of understanding the player journey. My huge concern is I don't think we want to get ourselves into a situation where we have an over-reliance on financial indicators. Financial indicators are obviously important, but they are one part of the equation. There are many, many people that suffer gambling-related harm who will talk to you in great detail about what that harm was. And they talk to you about the loss of relationships. They talk to you about the loss of self-respect. They talk to you about how it impacted their mental health and other areas of their life. And they will actually say the money was the easy bit to get back. You know, you can always make more money. So whilst the indicators are important, and they do show that there could be potential behavior patterns, I do think we've got to broaden it much, much more than just this financial focus. And it really concerns me that we see regulators across Europe sort of setting financial thresholds and thinking that that is the, sorry to use a conference buzzword, but that's the silver bullet. There isn't a silver bullet in this. And it's important that we join up all of this knowledge and understanding across the whole piece and work together on it. But I think as an early life indicator, if we had that data coming in from day one, we had that understanding coming in from day one, and then at some point your behavioral model takes over, then you've got something very, very powerful.
Yeah, sorry, Tom, but I can't help but agree more. I mean, one of the indicators in the US that we've been looking at too is frequency. Like you can be micro betting $1 a day, $1 every hour, and never trigger a financial marker. However, because you're basically making it into a habit, into a customary thing that you do every day, that is this sort of behavior.
Preoccupation, right? It's all you're thinking about. Yeah. Agree.
And my last comment on that was, I completely agree with Paula. I don't think financial data should replace kind of the existing behavioral analysis that is out there to protect players. I think it's very much around just using that data in a way that complements the existing approach.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you all very much for the comments on that topic. Really interesting. Paula, did you have anything else?
Yeah, I just want to add that if we did work together on this, I think we could generate something very, very cool. And I think it's a conversation that we should continue.
Yeah,
Definitely.
And Max, I agree with your point that I as well don't think that banks should be the one having the conversation with the customers. I very much agree that it's the gambling operators that should be having those conversations. But to move on, just so we get through as much as possible, Zach, you've already talked a little bit about the Safe Bet Act, and it seems very unlikely to be passed. But at the same time, it seems that it is going to impact responsible gambling in the US. And I know in its recent incarnation, it seems to be focused on VIP programs and potentially trying to outlaw those. Apart from what you've already mentioned, what do you think the other impacts of the Safe Bet Act are going to be on responsible gambling in the US?
Sure, and just to back it up a little bit to get some background. So since 2018, which is when Passover was repealed, sports betting and gambling in the US traditionally has been not federally regulated whatsoever, with limited exceptions such as anti-money laundering through the Bank Secrecy Act and other legislation. So this is really one of the first times we're seeing the federal government really take a very focused interest in the gambling regimens that have been implemented over the last 5 or 6 years. So the Safe Bet Act, which is the Supporting Affordability with Every Bet Act, has been introduced by Congressman Paul Tonko of New York and Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut. And I think it's important to understand why this is being introduced and generated. So over the last few years, 2 or 3, we've seen an increase in targeted athlete harassment in the US. So one of the pieces within the Safe Bet Act that has been very focused on is the removal of the ability to do proposition bets on college performances, whether that's individual athlete performances or a more general proposition bet that has traditionally been allowed. Alongside that, we've also seen a curbing of advertising, whether that's restrictions or outright bans between the hours of 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. being proposed. So in terms of the effect that it has had on individual states from an RG perspective, responsible gambling, it's really been heavily focused on the advertising portion. And if I would go a step further, focused on the college experience and trying to remove that risk of athlete harassment, which is also tied into the advent of name, image, likeness rights for US-based athletes in the college ranks. So the bills that have been introduced in the last few months after the Safe Bet Act that was reintroduced this year, whether it's Illinois or Massachusetts and New York, are all targeting advertising. So in terms of what is being targeted in the advertising, we're looking at things that are limiting the ability to advertise whistle to whistle, so within games, the restriction of the ability to advertise between the hours of 8 a.m. and 10 p.m., which again is unlikely to pass for a number of reasons, including the ubiquitousness of advertising in the US market. And the thing that is interesting there is effectively what we're seeing is more conversation starters with regulators and the industry into what actually makes sense based on these principles. And it's really a clear signal posting of principles that the federal legislators want regulators to pay attention to when they regulate this moving forward, with the caveat being that it's a warning that if state regulators are not seen to be doing enough, particularly on the advertising portion, that there will be federal intervention of some kind at the legislative level, which, if you're in the industry in the US, is something that gives heart palpitations to most operators. So I think we're seeing the beginning of conversations when it comes to this, particularly related to restrictions, affordability checks, and to Paula's interest, the banning of the use of AI in the sports betting context in Illinois, which I'll read exactly what they're trying to ban. they're basically trying to ban the ability of operators to use AI to track the sports wagers of an individual, create an offer or promotion targeting a specific individual, or creating a gambling product such as a micro bet based on the tracking of player behavior. So that's like kind of like the beginning of the signal fire that AI restriction is something that is culminating in certain conversations at the regulator level.
Yeah, interested to see where that goes. Right, my gut feeling on this is you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. You know, AI is all around us, and I think it would be pretty tricky to ban it in this context. It's very clear that the areas they're targeting are the commercial areas, right? They're trying to stop AI being used for commercial purposes, but my own view on this, I talked about this again quite recently. I personally, these are my views, not Mindway's, but I personally don't have any issue with operators using the same sort of AI technology on the commercial side. I think it's perfectly legitimate, and it's a perfectly legitimate way to do business. I just want them to join it up so that they also look at those players through a lens of risk as well, and that is applied and understood so that certain products might be sort of taken out of marketing that are sent to certain individuals, just as much as the AI might be used to sort of drive players onto other products. I think if you've got that good understanding of what that individual's behavior is, and you've got an ethical approach to it, then personally I don't really have an issue with it, but we'll see what they come out with.
Now, to your point, like about the HI married with AI, this is basically helping to determine and find and discover different markers that are not just financial. It's customer analytics, but I would go further and say we can use this for problem gambling and responsible gambling analytics for ethical intervention. Like, it doesn't have to be divorced entirely from the conversation. And the other piece there too is, as we've seen in the US with, and this is outside of gambling, but conversation on the Hill about Meta's business model, for example, a large piece of this is also educating the legislators and regulators of what actually do we mean by artificial intelligence. Is it generative AI? Is it LLMs? Is it this? Is it that? So I think there's also a piece of trying to get the people writing the policies, laws, etc., to understand what are we using, how are we using it, and what do we mean by these terms.
And the pace at which it's moving, Zach, I think that that is something else that needs to be factored in here. AI is obviously a lot of things. We've already discussed sort of large language models, machine learning. It's around us in everything we do, from our Spotify daily mix to the parking sensors in our cars. It's like, how are you going to define this and put it in a box? It's going to be very tricky, but I'll be watching with interest.
Yeah, I've got a Spotify DJ right on the side, like telling me my new recommendation, like right now. So that works out too.
Okay. Well, thanks, Zach, for that. Those really great insights on the Safe Bet Act. Might be a nice segue into my next question about cultural differences. So, how do cultural differences impact responsible gambling strategies in different parts of the world? I'll open this up to all of you. So who would like to go first on this one?
I don't mind picking it up.
I'll pick one of you.
I don't mind. I don't mind.
Paula, you go first.
I love this question. I love the psychology side of what we do. So I find this really interesting. And obviously, we're working with operators in 62 different international regulatory jurisdictions. So we do see a lot of differences in gambling behavior from one jurisdiction to another. It's not just about building in the different regulatory regime. It's about understanding the player, that the behavior you're looking at. So I think some of the key differences that we see are some of the emerging markets, the likes of Brazil, some of the markets over in Africa. You see very different betting patterns in general across the whole population, where you tend to see a pattern of much more wagers for a much less amount of money. And I think so that needs to be understood, and that needs to be sort of built into what you're doing. So what we try to do is we bring in experts from local regions as well to train the algorithm for certain customers, if they want to build that kind of cultural context in there. I think the other really interesting piece about this is one of our experts, Annika Lindberg, and you guys can look this up. I think that the talk where she spoke about this is online, but she gave a really, really interesting talk at an event that I was at last year, where she was saying how actually the routes into problematic behavior differ vastly. You see gender differences, you see cultural differences based on jurisdiction of where, you know, where people are based in the world. You see generational differences. All of that exists, and the routes are different. You see different drivers of how people get to this sort of position where their behavior becomes like something that is potentially problematic for them. But actually, by the time they reach the sort of high and very high risk category, what you start to see is those behaviors manifesting in the same way, regardless of what the route in was, which I thought was super interesting. Now, I've probably got a couple of observations on that. That's really great and gives us a lot of insight into what is happening by people that hit that high and very high risk tier. But actually, how do we then make sure that people aren't getting into that tier at the first place? And that for me is where the sort of cultural understanding, the different journeys, the different routes, that's where it's so important. And again, it goes back to this kind of personalization of any kind of interaction and intervention we're having with people before they get to that stage, nudging them back to sustainability, assessing the efficacy of that interaction, and then sort of, do we need to interact again, or do we try something else? But yeah, I love the psychology side of it. I think it's really, really fascinating.
Thank you for that answer. So it seems like operators, just as they think about, you know, when they're entering a new market, you know, understanding that market and the culture and the products they offer, they will have to do the same in terms of responsible gambling. So understanding the cultural differences in the different regions they operate and how they need to personalize their responsible gambling approach to sort of, you know, take into account those cultural differences. Another question.
Tom, sorry to jump in. Yeah, and actually go a step further, and I think it was someone at OLG in Ontario that mentioned this at a talk a few years ago. But even within a given market, there are cultural differences that you have to be aware of within the different ethnic groups, generational groups that market. I think OLG was using something called generational anchoring benchmarks, GAB, to kind of datafy those markers, but the behavior of certain ethnic groups within the gambling industry also differ, where they may be frequently betting without it rising to this word gambling, whereas another group may be having the same frequency of gambling, but for them that would be this word gambling. And similarly, when you look at cultural differences, you even have to look at people that have been living in their countries, because, for example, if you or someone that used to live in Australia and now you move to the US, you're betting it during unsociable hours on Australian football does not necessarily qualify as a sport gambling. It may just be your passion that you're betting on that sport, even if it occurs at 3 a.m. because of time differences or whatever. So I think, and this goes back to personalization of RG solutions and where AI uses can be really, really useful, is really determining what is the pattern of behavior of that individual within their cultural context in their small community, but also within the given market that they are based in.
And that's why context is so important, and that's why you need to build it in. And the only way, again, we're doing all these story arcs during this webinar, but the only way to do that is by keeping that human insight in there, keeping that contextual understanding. And it's a great example you use there of somebody who might be seen to be sort of, you know, betting during the early hours of the morning. But if you analyze that and you see they're betting on a particular sport, it exists outside of the time, outside of their time zone, that's very, very different from somebody else who might be betting during the evening into the early hours of the morning, and the betting patterns are erratic across different product sets. These are two very, very different players that need to be dealt with in very, very different ways. I think it's a really good one to sort of bring that out, Zach.
Okay. Just building on the idea of personalization in responsible gambling, and it was something that Max touched upon earlier. Would providing players with more information regarding their gambling behavior help them to gamble more responsibly? Something I read recently about a major gambling operator who is really trying to provide players with the maximum amount of information, charts, graphs, trying to educate them on their the way they play and understand the way they play to help them gamble more responsibly. I'm expecting maybe not full agreement on this, but what does the panel think in terms of providing that level of information? Would that help a player gamble more responsibly?
I don't even agree with myself on this, Tom. I've got split views on it.
Okay. Well, do you want to start us off, Paula, then?
So
that's not that thing.
Exactly. we obviously live in this era where we get stats on everything. We've all got sort of Apple Watches or Fitbits, and we're looking at our stats. Our phone's telling us how many steps we've done, all the rest of it. We're so used to tracking stats. And I think that that's good because it makes people mindful. It makes them aware of what they're doing. On the flip side of that, there is, I think, any kind of stats around gambling behavior that are delivered to what is potentially a vulnerable individual needs to be done really, really carefully. So it's a tricky nut to crack, right? Because there is a school of thought that tells us that if this is displayed in a way that isn't necessarily done in such a careful manner, that actually having access to those stats could cause somebody to do more loss chasing, because their thought pattern might be, I need to recoup what I've lost here. So you've got to make sure that what you're presenting is done with that in mind. And I think I kind of feel like having that human interaction again, that conversation where the individual can see themselves in that, but you can bring some empathy and some humanity into it, is probably in some ways going to be better than just serving up a load of stats on a screen. And obviously there are ways to do that, but I think it's important that it's considered.
No, I could jump in there too. Like, some states actually require that those stats be made readily available to players. But the flip side of making so many stats available, so much information available, is information blindness. You might not look at that information, and therefore you're defeating the purpose. So I think there is a line, to Paula's point, where transparency is good and the information should be made available. But the method of distribution, dissemination, delivery of that information does need to be done in a very careful and deliberate way for maximum impact. Because if you're just making that information available to a patron that requests it or has that information readily made available, their use of that information may not be what you want them to use it for.
Yeah, agree. And I'm just thinking from like an analogy around this, or a user case. I might be tracking my weight from my scales that's telling me how my weight's going, and I might pick that up and I might be like, oh, great. Okay, so I've lost 4 pounds. So that means I can eat 2 cream cakes, right? And it is that same kind of mentality that we have to make sure that it's not just about delivering stats. It's about delivering knowledge, expertise about actually how to manage your gambling in a safe fashion alongside the stats, I would say.
And I would say, just to add to that, I completely agree with both Zach and Paula there. I think the example recently with Santander is quite poor, actually. It felt quite accusational in tone in terms of an intervention from the bank. And I suspect if banks elicit that type of behavior, they're going to lose customers because of that type of intervention. And I think from my experience with working on operators on this and looking at the opportunity to display financial data, I think there's two concerns really, which is the impact that has on the P&L and influencing behavior that ultimately causes the business to lose revenue. But then also just what exact information is valuable to the player and is going to promote sustainable gambling behavior thereafter, and that messaging being really key. So one of the operators we're working with is looking at displaying that information in a kind of insight section of their site, where it's not necessarily forced on the player, but it's for that player that's keener to engage, keener to look at insights in a very similar way that we might have that kind of general curiosity if we were looking at budgeting apps or spending apps, just to help them to understand how they're gambling and the impact that's potentially having on them financially.
And I think this goes back to this whole idea of actually responsible gambling, safer gambling, call it, I think we're going to talk about this in a bit, but call it whatever you want to call it. It's about it being for more than just the people that are at the top of that risk pyramid, that are high and very high risk. Probably those people in that high and very high risk pyramid top bit, they're not going to visit that part of the website. You know, denial is a huge part of the mindset of anybody who gets to that stage, and it's not an area for them. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be educating everybody else, and I think from that perspective it is a really, really good thing.
So to pick up on that point you raised there, Paula, in terms of the language of responsible gambling and the terminology, do you think responsible gambling terminology needs to change in order to resonate with players more? Because it seems that there's sort of a belief that sometimes, terms like responsible gambling, safer gambling, they don't really resonate with players. You've got some operators, I'm thinking in Australia of Crown casinos, they use the sort of terminology now, play safe, as a sort of way that they think that players are going to, interact with and be, it's going to resonate with them more using that kind of different terminology. So do you think more operators and even regulators need to sort of think about what terminology is really going to actually resonate with players?
Yes, is the short answer from me. I think there is an association with responsible gambling of being put on the naughty step. So if you have a safer gambling or a responsible gambling intervention, you sort of consider it as you're being pulled up on something. And I think that actually what we need to be doing is taking the conversation much, much broader, so that everybody understands how gambling works. Everybody understands how to play safely. I love the positive play handle that a lot of people are using these days. We work with the guys at Better Change who promote positive play across the industry, and actually some of the work that they do is they talk to all gamblers, not just problem gamblers. They go to people at sporting events and they talk to them about their experience, and what that would indicate, the work that they've done, is that there isn't even an awareness amongst the sort of broader gambling population or the broader gambling customer base of what responsible gambling is. It's kind of considered, I don't have a problem, so that's not for me. Well, I think we need to find something that is about educating everybody and lifting everybody's understanding up, so they don't end up in a position where they've got a problem. And if the wording around it is an issue there, then of course we should look at that.
No, I agree on that. I think part of it is also going back to psychology of why people participate in gambling. It's because it's fun. It's a dopamine reward. So putting terminology like responsible gambling, like player protection, puts a burden on the player of doing something to be able to participate. Whereas something like positive play is, while you're participating in this fun activity, you're going to get reward positively. So to Paula's point, it has broad appeal to both potential disordered population, but also the broader gambling population. I think that's where the terminology needs to go. We can't be, as an industry, intervening when disorderly conduct occurs. It needs to be early intervention, and focus on positive play, I think, is one way to do that, to doing that.
Just to add to what Paula and Zach have said there, I actually learned this lesson the painful way. So as part of my intelligent payment capability, I initially took that to market quite heavily associated with safer gambling terminology. So I was even calling it at that time the safer gambling payment method. And what we were finding with users, and even users that we could prove were actually quite high value spenders on gambling that might have fallen into someone that would need some type of intervention or protection. But players were turned off both on the more extreme end, but at the more normalized end as well, because they just couldn't resonate with the language. They felt, and this was specific to the UK, but there was almost this kind of apathy towards safer gambling because it felt a bit gimmicky. It felt that operators were just using that language because they had to. They didn't really mean anything by it. So that was a painful lesson, and we shifted a lot of our UX around our payment flow to move away from that. And actually the conversion rates dramatically increased by just normalizing the language completely. And like Paula, I know the folks at Positive Play, and they've helped to kind of influence some of my thinking here around just promoting exactly what it is and the value it's going to have to the user. And I think if the industry can actually just normalize the language and just make it part of their tooling or their infrastructure as an operator, I think there'll be more adoption.
Okay, thanks for all your comments on that topic. I think we've got time for one more topic before we go to questions from the audience. Something I read about recently was that in the Netherlands, they're thinking of raising the gambling age limit to 21 from 18 for some games. This would be the riskiest games of chance in the Netherlands regulator's opinion. Do you think, in general, raising gambling age limits would help to improve player protection? Maybe, Zach, if I could start with you on this one, because I think in the US, 21 is the limit for some gambling in the US. Is that right?
Yes, and at the risk of sounding flippant, we still have this sort of gambling here. It hasn't done really much material effect. So I think my position is clear on this one. But just going back, some tribal lands, I think North Dakota being one of them, actually allow gambling for 19-year-olds. So it's not even a one-size-fits-all across the U.S. But to your point, we've had the gambling age being 21 for participation in casino gaming, online gaming, and sports betting. And we still have a pretty noteworthy segment of the population that is under the suffering of this sort of gambling. So I think that, to use Paula's conference terminology earlier, raising the gambling age is seen as a silver bullet. However, it's just one bullet that tends to miss, like a Collinge trooper, the target of the shot.
Okay, that's interesting. I think some of the thinking is that as well, that some of the general research has suggested that maybe online casino is seen as more risky than sports betting. I mean, talking in general terms. But what do you think on this, Paula? Do you think there are certain games where we need to have a different age limit?
I don't know if there are certain games where we need to have a different age limit. I think that kids are being brought up these days with computer games, with video gaming, with features that have got in-app features that are identical to what you see in gambling, and they're learning it from a very, very early age. I think that, you know, there's different angles that you can look at this at, but I think it's about keeping a closer eye on those younger players. So neuroscience tells us that the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until about the age of 25. Now, this is the part of the brain that is responsible for impulse control, right? So there is a very good reason why a lot of regulators are saying that operators should keep a closer eye on younger players. I think that is very, very different from banning them altogether or saying they can't play until they're older. We actually develop sort of positive habits as well in those formative years. So again, I think it comes back to this whole idea of positive play, this whole idea of actually educating people on what gambling is about, making sure they understand odds when they're joining in those early days, communicating with them how to use the products on the site, and checking in with them, keeping a closer eye, putting different controls around them, getting alerts earlier for those players, because you want to make sure that they are creating positive habits early on and not habits that are going to sort of spiral and escalate, rather than saying, no. I mean, my view, it's kind of a bit like prohibition, right? We know history tells us prohibition doesn't work. Let's kind of be a little bit more intelligent about that, but use the science and the information that we do have available to us to do it in a controlled, kind of protected way. That doesn't, we haven't gone there on channelization and the black market on this call, and I'm very happy we haven't. It's probably the only one I've seen in a while, but actually do it in a way that isn't pushing people towards that as well.
No, and to that point, like, you make it to a taboo, you're going to make people already participate in the industry once they're available at full strength. Whereas, to your point, if you keep it at a younger age, you can train and educate the younger population to organically develop those positive play habits to reduce, in a long-term planning strategy, the amount of disordered gamblers, because they've developed those positive play habits at an earlier age.
Okay, thanks, everyone. Go ahead, Max. Finish us off on this topic.
There's nothing I can really add to what Paula and Zach have said, because that's a really comprehensive overview, I think. But I would just concur that, to me, it feels like a really blunt instrument to provide that kind of restriction. I think we should be in the business of promoting the gambling industry and making it work for all of the participants in the industry. So like Paula said, there are ways that we can look to manage younger players through their life cycle with an operator that might be slightly different to someone of a slightly older age. So I think we should, and the regulators should, look to kind of innovative tooling and solutions as a way to promote more sustainable practice and encourage that from a young age.
Okay, thanks very much. We've covered a lot of topics so far, and we're going to go to some questions now from the audience. So the first one is about duty of care requirements. Do gambling operators need to become more proactive in order to comply with increasingly demanding duty of care requirements in Europe? Just to give a bit of context on this week there was a decision from the Swedish gambling authority where they fined an operator for not doing enough to comply with the duty of care requirements in Sweden. And even though the operator had taken some action to try and interact with the customer and contact them about their gambling, the authority felt that it wasn't intrusive enough, in terms of it didn't do enough to really try and change the customer's behavior, or wasn't done soon enough. So do operators, to be able to meet these new requirements in countries like Sweden, Belgium, the Netherlands, do they need to be more proactive, in your opinion? Maybe Max, could we start with you on that one?
I would say in relation to this question, I think, and that specific scenario you mentioned there in Sweden sounds like it sort of feels like a opportunity there for the kind of operators tried to take an intervention, and then the regulator has kind of put a financial impact onto the operator as a result of that. I think the general principle, and you see it in the financial industry around banks having more regulatory pressure to have customer protection type intervention and make sure that they're promoting and looking after vulnerable customers. So I think generally regulation supporting the advancement of tooling and the encouragement of operators to take intervention is a positive thing. I think And actually, I've been encouraged by, say, the UK Gambling Commission's approach in looking at affordability around open banking in the background of what they've been looking at with the enhanced risk checks, is that they're taking their time to understand open banking and how it can be used appropriately, and potentially will come back at a later stage with a policy that's more thought through than potentially what was done in the Netherlands, where they imposed quite harsh affordability checks at 30% of income and imposed that quite quickly on the operators, which didn't give them time to react or put in suitable tooling or ways to do that made sense for the operator economically. So I think there does need to be a balance between regulation that's for good, but actually practically how can operators deliver against that, and giving them the understanding to be able to enact that regulation in the best possible way.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Max. Another question we've had is about potentially operators being too reliant on technology and systems for responsible gambling. Something that's been in the news recently about this, which may be relevant, is that there's been some examples of self-exclusion system failures in Norway and France, with one example in France being that because of a system failure, customers who were trying to self-exclude for a number of months, say 12 months, were actually only excluded for 12 days because of a system failure. So we talked about humans needing to stay behind responsible gambling. Are some operators too reliant on systems for responsible gambling? Zach, what do you think about this one?
I think, and we've seen similar enforcement actions in the U.S. for similar type of self-exclusion system failures. So I think it goes back to the point we've made repeatedly on this webinar, which is you cannot divorce the human and the human intelligence factor from intervention, where that's validation of the data for self-exclusion, validation of the system working on a weekly or 10-day basis. There needs to always be a human at the during the process to basically be verifying the tech is working as expected or patching any mistake. But I think the reliance on technology and over-reliance on technology is a problem in any industry that is innovating at a quick pace, like the gaming industry. I think it's just a case of need to learn from other industries, as well as the ongoing mistake is probably the best word to use, not failure, but mistakes that are ongoing when it comes to use of technology in this space.
Can I just add something there? Because we're focusing here on system failures. But the flip side, I would say, of this is when you take something like player tracking and trying to detect these patterns, there is absolutely no way that you would be able to do this to any kind of level of accuracy on the scale at which we have to do it. When you consider some of our customers have literally millions of players, there is no way you could do that without the technology. So I think we're in a much, much better position with it there. I just think we have to engage our human brains as well and not take it as gospel, but take it as guidance and help and information that makes us more intelligent around how we go about our roles.
Yeah, to put it into an analogy, the human and technology need to be a long, healthy, lasting marriage, not just a dating hot and cold kind of situation.
I love that. And I agree.
Thanks for answering that one. And just a final question before we wrap up. If we talk about new markets, for example, in 2026, we expect online casino to be a licensing regime for online casino to be set up in New Zealand. I know as well in Finland, for example, they're working towards a licensing regime. What different strategies could online gambling operators employ to help players gamble responsibly in those new markets? Because obviously in a new market, you're to some extent starting with a blank canvas. You're not trying to bring in responsible gambling policies to a market that's already active. You've got a chance to start afresh. So do you have any sort of thoughts on maybe things that could be done differently in new markets for responsible gambling? I don't know if anyone wants to take that one.
I'm not sure I entirely agree with, or in fact, I'm sure I don't agree with you that you're starting afresh. I think when you look at all of these markets, you have situations where it's either been a state monopoly or like in the instance of Brazil, where there has been a grey or black market for a certain amount of time. And what you actually have there is gambling, but not information around the prevalence. So my advice for any sort of new market is to learn from what has gone before, learn from history. I think the Brazilian market have done this really, really well, where they are embracing technology from day dot. I think they've set a really good, robust sort of framework up there. Obviously, I know there's more work to be done, but I like to see them not being afraid to mandate things like player tracking and not being afraid to embrace the technology that exists. I think that is the way to do it. Learn the mistakes that other markets have made. We see market after market open up and we see the same things happen. We see a flood of marketing going into that market. Then we see the regulator going, oh, hang on a minute. Then we see conversation around marketing being completely banned. Like, let's be sensible about these things from day dot and try and strike the right sort of level with it all. That would be my main advice, but I don't think they're genuinely new markets. I think gambling has always existed.
I agree with that point. I think it's basically getting away from the near-term kind of strategy of customer acquisition, flooding the airways with marketing advertising, and getting responsible advertising from the ground up day one, so that you can work with the regulator to make sure the advertising and marketing that you do need for customer acquisition is still done at the patron's interest at heart at all times, so you don't have a situation where the backlash neuters the ability to market your products.
Okay, thanks, Paula and Zach, for answering that question. We've come to the end now of our discussion, so I'd just like to thank Paula, Max, and Zach very much for coming onto this panel discussion and talking about so many different areas of responsible gambling. I think we've been able to cover a lot of topics today. I think we could have talked for longer, which is a testament to your knowledge and enthusiasm for the subject. But thank you very much for joining us. Some information about how you can get in touch with Vixio for some more information. We've got our email address at info@vixio.com and our website vixio.com, where you can get more information on this discussion we've had. So it's just left to me to thank you for listening to us today, and hopefully you can join us again in the future for another Vixio panel discussion or webinar.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to our speakers. And finally, thank you for attending today's session. As mentioned at the start of the broadcast, this webinar was recorded and a video will be sent out to all attendees in the coming days. If you asked a question during the broadcast that was not answered, a member of the Vixio team will look to get back to you with a reply in the coming days. And finally, if you have any further questions about anything discussed in today's webinar, please feel free to get in touch with us via email at info@vixio.com or via the website vixio.com for more information. Thank you for attending today's webinar.